One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt. One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt.
individual without any criminal record raised 3 U.S. citizen kids who some of them were now doing phenomenal things in school, potentially professionals now, and the parents are still undocumented, and they were getting picked up by us. Apologize, I have my dogs in the back barking. If you hear that, I apologize. But my point to that is that's one of the things that we've seen now. There is a lot of more discretion. So one of the things that we're doing at the court system is we're doing something called dismissal without prejudice. The problem with that is it's just a band-aid. We're leaving a lot of humans in limbo because they're not being deported. They don't have a criminal record. They have U.S. citizen kids, but they entered unlawfully, right? So they're just not eligible to become residents. And one of the quick rules to determine how easy somebody can become a resident or not is whether or not they entered lawfully or not. If somebody entered the U.S. without authorization, right? They entered without permission, even if they have a kid who later who's born here and turns 21, that child cannot petition them for them to just become a lawful permanent resident. So this whole concept of an anchor baby, where you hear things like that, it's just non-existent. It's not true. The only time that you ever see that scenario play out the way that people portray it on TV and say it's so simple is if you came into the U.S. lawfully with a tourist visa, you overstayed, and then your U.S. citizen son or daughter petitions you at the age of 21. So first of all, you got to wait for them to turn 21. And second, you have to have entered lawfully. All of that is relevant because it's very difficult for an actual visa, a tourist visa, to be approved. You have to prove that you have money. So it's already making it very difficult. And it's a huge biased system based on income. So I wanted to share with that, and I know you're going to ask very pointed questions, and we can get into docket TPS, what we're seeing in the courts. But I want to remind folk of this because it's just an unfortunate reality. And even though we are seeing a lot more discretion with Biden, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot more folk continuously staying in limbo. And that's where, what do we do with them, right? Yes, I'm not going to be deported, but I still don't have a work authorization. My son or my daughter still can't help me. What do we do in that scenario? So we really are just putting a band-aid on a much deeper, more important issue. The other thing is going through the court system. So in Nevada, and it varies, but in Nevada, if you're fighting a case in court, it's reasonable for you to expect to wait 2 to 4 years before you see the conclusion of your case. That's another thing that you should keep in mind, because that's 2 to 4 years of lawyers. That's 2 to 4 years of uncertainty. That's 2 to 4 years of administrations changing. Imagine if you have a friendly administration and then in a few months it changes, right? That's just a constant concern. That is just where the political pendulum swings. And that's frightening. So that's the type of stuff that I constantly remind folk. And that's the type of stuff that a president doesn't fix. That's the type of stuff that we change with the Senate and our members of Congress coming with some real solutions. I think we put a lot of this emphasis on our current president, but we really should be putting it, if we want something real and concrete, we need both houses to vote on it and send it up for the president to sign. And I'll leave it at that. And I know we have a lot of other stuff, so I don't want to go any deeper. And I'll wait for questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I'm so glad that you started us off that way, because I think that leads really into the larger conversation piece, that there is so much mis and disinformation around immigration. And you touched on it perfectly. There, a lot of people have this concept of, just wait your turn, just get in line, just do the right way. And it's really not that simple. It's super nuanced, and I think people don't understand that. It makes it much easier for them to kind of buy that misinformation, that disinformation. It allows people to just frankly think like, these harsh and frankly inhumane or unfair laws are okay because they should have followed the right path, when it's not the case at all. So I want to turn over to Zach, because there is, like I mentioned, that was just a taste of some of the misinformation. There is a ton of disinformation that we're seeing, especially right now, as the election picks up. I feel like every time there is an election, the topic of immigration gets kind of heightened and the disinformation kind of runs wild. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those disinformation narratives and the harmful effects like the Great Replacement Theory and all those frankly racist discourses happening currently nationally?
Yeah, so I'll be kind of quick and pretty do a larger kind of overview for folks here. And I think you are right that in the election cycle, we're going to see lots of mis and disinformation around about immigrants, about immigration. So I think the thing that's really helpful to keep in mind is oftentimes we're going to hear things about open borders or immigrants committing crime or lots of different other kinds of scaring and fear-mongering narratives about immigrants and about migrants crossing the border. But many times the folks that are perpetuating that kind of disinformation are not actually just talking about immigrants. They're not just talking about immigration policy, but it is a mechanism and a tool to try to divide around concerns around safety, around concerns around identity, concerns around scarcity. So I think that's important to start off with, is that not only is it hardly always about just immigrants themselves, but I think it's helpful when hearing some of this information that is negative towards immigrants. We have to ask, who is doing this and why are they doing it? How do they benefit from that kind of politics of division? So you mentioned something about the Great Replacement Theory, and I think really a concern in some of the tracking of some of this disinformation narratives across the country. And we've seen a marked increase and a rise of elected officials actually embracing this sort of racist and bigoted conspiracy theory. So where we see is that, even in the month of January alone, just on the platform X, we have tracked over 300 elected officials that have used and embraced a version of the Great Replacement Theory just in the month of January. So we're seeing this from not just the most extreme candidates, but candidates up and down the ticket on local levels, on candidates running for Senate, running for the House, and of course for president as well. And I think why it's really important for us to think about that rhetoric, particularly around an argument that there's a migrant invasion or that there is a plot or an intentional effort by Democrats or elites to bring in non-white migrants to replace voters and create a Democratic majority. That's kind of the racist conspiracy theory that we hear. When we hear rhetoric about invasion or some of this other stuff, it's really important because it adds a threat to public safety, because there have been multiple domestic terrorist attacks where individuals have been inspired by that rhetoric to commit harm in our communities across the country. The DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas even confirmed in Congress and warned that when elected officials use the language of the Great Replacement Theory, including invasion rhetoric, that heightens the level of threat to our national security. And so I think it's really important that for folks that are out here, and we can all maybe disagree on what is the exact right policy that we need for immigration. But I think there's a line that we need to be clear to not to cross when the rhetoric that we are using creates harm in our community and creates a climate of political violence. And I think the other thing to think about this is really important going into this election year, about how some of these disinformation narratives, specifically around the Great Replacement Theory and this invasion rhetoric, are using immigrants as a tool to justify and socialize the idea that we should overturn our democracy. Because they're saying, well, there's all these migrants coming in, and Democrats did this on purpose to rig the vote. And I think that's really important for us to name now, that conversation is out there so that we can say that's a false, that's a lie. And because it's important for us to do that, not just about respecting the humanity of immigrants, but also protecting our democracy. Now, I think there are several other disinformation narratives. Happy to talk a little bit about them some more here, but I'll end there. And just because I think the kind of the Great Replacement invasion stuff was what you said, I think is kind of top line of a major concern, I think, as we're going through and seeing from elected leaders and making sure we're really forceful in the condemnation
pawns as those scapegoats. And I want to turn it back over to Tony, because I think you're right. Like, we know what's happening nationally, and we know it's happening, at the local level. As far as the insight into policy matters, Tony, surrounding immigration, what do you think is some shit? And I know this is kind of a loaded question, so feel free to go anywhere you feels right with it. But how can we shift the conversation away from using immigrants as like political pawns and towards meaningful reform?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question because it's something we saw recently, right? I think it's more a conversation about power, right? Unfortunately, Latina folks don't have the power as much as certain groups do. So I think it's about how do we attain that power, and I think it's attached to Latina folks are like the lowest voting minority demographic, right? So it's easy to ignore us until election season comes around at the very end, the tail end of election season, right? And that's unfortunate. We saw recently in Senator Sinema's border bill, right? Some, in our opinion, some horrendous things that were put in there that we think was a bad deal on the Democrats' side. We were very vocal, and we've been vocal that we're disappointed in the senator's vote in favor of this, right? I think that one thing that folks like groups like ours that we need to do is increase our power, right? And one thing that we're focusing on is making sure that Latina folks become regular voters, because that way we don't get pushed to the side, right? We saw, quite frankly, organizations like APACS and the National Border Patrol Council were put a priority, and those support for those groups were touted when this bill was brought forward, which is a disappointment. I don't think that groups like ours nationally were involved in the conversation. And it's something we're going to keep sharing. So I think the only way that we can be prioritizing the conversation is if we are competing with those sorts of organizations and increasing our power. And I feel pretty strongly about that. We saw things in the bill that would have hurt a lot of our members, folks that I represent, and it's something that we can't support, right? Things like trigger numbers to shut down the border, where folks would potentially be stuck at the border. And like Senator Flores had mentioned, folks travel from Guatemala, a lot of these Latin American countries to the Mexican border. And if, according to Kristen Sinema, the border would have been shut down for the entire year. I don't know that she knows what she's talking about, but if that was accurate, that would be horrendous for people seeking asylum, right? But I will leave it at that. I think it's a conversation about power, and organizations like mine who represent immigrants and minorities as a whole have to increase their power. That way we are not ignored moving forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why we have Cinthia on too. She's gonna tell us all about people power and kind of that intersectionality and how we kind of harness our powers in our communities to make some changes. But before I jump to Cinthia, I did want to throw it back to the senator, because because you had mentioned like some harsh policy ideas from Kristen Sinema in Arizona. Obviously, we know that Senator Abbott has his crazy, inhumane lawsuit that went up to the Supreme Court now regarding the Rio Grande barriers. And I just wanted to, before we talk about the people power portion, Senator, I wanted to ask you, like, as someone that represents the state, our governor supported Abbott in his decision to protect the state, or whatever he claimed he was doing. And I wanted to see if I can get some kind of your insight on that.
Sure. Well, I'll start off with kind of the question that you asked, Tony, and some of the stuff that Zachary touched on, which is for too long, elected officials, and obviously more on one side, but if we're frank and honest, on both sides of the aisle, we've made a lot of mistakes, because we've approached the conversation about immigrants as a question of what do they mean to us as a voting bloc or a voting power. And it's understandable, because if you're a campaign, your question is how many folk will vote. Well, one of the realities if any one of you runs for office, if any one of you has ever ran a campaign, and I would argue that most of you have been involved behind the scenes of a campaign and or have ran a campaign directly as a candidate for somewhere in the state or somewhere else. The very first thing that they're going to tell you is focus on the 3 out of 3, and we all know what that means. The people who voted in the last 3 elections. It is the way a campaign is designed, and it's strategic, and it makes sense. You want to focus on the people that are most likely to vote. And so the way a campaign is designed from the ground up on both sides of the aisle is focus on those who voted in the last 3 elections. Well, we typically didn't have women running for office, communities of color, et cetera, we're recycling the same 3 out of 3s forever because it's a perpetual approach. If we said vote for the 3 out of 3 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, we consistently are focusing on the same people. Where the disconnect is that if we can stop talking about humans as just a voting block, although it's important, and I don't want to minimize that because we do need to get people to vote. The only way we're going to do that, the only way this rhetoric is going to stop, is if after you win, run for the first time, pay attention to the consultants, get the 3 out of 3. But then after you win, it is your job to go to the 0s out of 3. Because why the heck have they not voted in the last 3 times? Because they feel disenfranchised. No one's spoken to them. No one's invested a single nickel or dime on them. So one of the things we got to remind people to vote is you want to become the 3 out of 3 because all of a sudden people are investing in you now to pander to you, to listen to you, to sit down with you. But the only way that's ever going to happen is if elected officials, after they win, push back on this narrative that I'm only going to go to the 3 out of 3s. No, the 3 out of 3s are important and you have to go to them. But I have to push back on that now and explain to you that we haven't been getting all these other humans and we got to bring them into the space. So that's really important. Number one. And then number two, kind of moving into the question of all these harmful policies, what Governor Lombardo jumped on the bandwagon and everybody disguises it. Oh, I'm doing it for this one reason and that other reason. The bottom line is you continue to be a political pawn. And if we continue to talk about the community in that way and treat them in that way, they're not going to be involved. They're not going to be supportive. The other thing I always remind folks is our messaging has to be very narrowly tailored to immigrants, because a lot of folk left because they feel that they were disenfranchised by their government. They feel that they were ignored, that they didn't have political power. They feel that there wasn't a place for them. So that when they come to the US, for us to assume that first or second generations are going to immediately jump in on politics is just difficult without actual investment. And we have to change our entire approach to it, reminding them you left XYZ place. Here's what was taken away from you. Here's where your actual power lies. And then on the policy side, one of my big asks from everybody, from nonprofits, from city council members, assembly folks, senators, is consistently push pro-immigrant bills, even if they don't pass. And the reason I say that is the other side is consistently pushing anti-immigrant rhetoric historically. And if that's the way they've always operated, one of the things that one of the most frustrating things I hear from our side is when somebody tells me, well, that's a federal thing, we can't do anything about it. I'm always like, what the fuck do you mean? Like, how can you say that? Everything that's ever been done against the immigrant community has started from the bottom up. The rhetoric doesn't reach the national level without starting at home with some nasty, horrible, and only English, all these different ordinances, how difficult it is for you to open a business. If I try to get a loan right now to open a taqueria or versus a McDonald's, what are the chances of me getting one versus the other? Well, McDonald's, we know that. They're tested. Maybe we should start with that. But you try to open up some type of cuisine, all of this is disguised. And it's historically disproportionately been impacting the same communities forever. So, I always tell folk, as much as you hear that horrible rhetoric, that racist rhetoric, that we know might not go anywhere, but that's what we're hearing. Where's the other side of that coin? Even if we feel that we're not going to move the legislation, propose it constantly so that the rhetoric is there's people here that are consistently trying to move, just even if it's just a millimeter in the right direction. That's the way we send the message to a community. That's the way we get people involved. That's the way we get people engaged. I know I'm the first to tell you I hate doing things that are symbolic. I hate it. I think we have an obligation to get things passed, but I also think we have a responsibility and obligation to consistently put the rhetoric that counters all the other garbage that is constantly hitting the media streams. Because if you ask like a typical family that watches the news for 30 minutes while they're eating in a different language, whatever language that may be, I guarantee you they're going to hear all the rhetoric about how they're going after them. I also want to be able to counter that by having a lot of stuff that's saying, here's where we're trying to help at every level of government. Everything involves immigrants, in my opinion, particularly in Nevada, because the only reason you immigrate to anywhere is better education, access to healthcare, power, economic, family. It's all the same reasons. That's all immigration is. It's not just like some mystery, right? And so that you fix at the city level, a city council level, at the board level, at the assembly level, at the Senate level. Everything we do needs to be catered in that way. And my ask is for the next few months, for the next few years, until we get tired of doing this, we have to just sincerely be at the table and presenting legislation at all costs that is really empowering our folk. And so that's how we counter that garbage. That's how we counter the governor. That's how we counter the garbage that's happening nationwide. We just have folk in there that care, and that's you all. None of this happens without you.
Thank you so much. I think that is really important because Zach was talking a little bit about the kind of strategic racism, and then you brought in like, but it happens at the beginning, at the city level, with more overt racism, with more challenges that we see. I wanted to bring Cinthia into because we always. The thing too with immigration is, and with any of our issues, right, is that we know that they don't happen in a vacuum. We know that they intersect with in our communities in lots of different ways and with a lot of different issues. And I was hoping, Cinthia, you could talk about your activism and advocacy and community engagement and how you navigate. I know that you specialize more in environmental issues, but how you navigate that intersectionality with environment and immigration reform, and how these areas of advocacy kind of can make for a more inclusive, equitable policies and communities, talking a little bit about that people power that Tony had mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paula. I really appreciate that. One of the things is that there's a big misconception that people immigrate to this country because they're trying to take our jobs. I'm an immigrant myself. My family came from Jalisco, Mexico. The town where my dad is from and his family lives has been directly impacted by environmental racism. They have the largest river of Mexico running through their town, and at one point they had a beautiful waterfall. Santa Maria. They had a beautiful waterfall, and in the 70s, a lot of companies came in from Germany, the United States, Japan. They built this amazing factory a corridor where they came with the promise of amazing jobs and good paying jobs. And most of my family was able to benefit from that, where one of my uncles is now the president of their local union there. But what they're encountering is, because there's nothing, they came in, they started dumping all the chemicals in this river, the waterfall dried up. There's a lot of huge cases of cancer, kids born with deformities, just a lot of really bad things. But at the same time, that also affected the crops and issues there that my family is currently facing. My father and my mom came out here to look for a better life for me. And I think there's a big misconception as to why people are coming here. It's because of climate migration. The UN Office of Refugees has estimated that 90% of the refugees around the world right now are migrating. They're leaving their families behind. They're coming to other countries because of climate change. So that's 90% of the folks that are being affected. On average, right now, as it stands, there's about 55 million people due to a natural disaster, a drought. We know in Latin America, agriculture is big. Agriculture is big in the small town where my mom is from. So I know hearing stories, from that, it is affecting their crops. So people are coming here. The UN is estimating that 1.2 billion people will have to migrate due to climate change or a natural disaster by 2050. So over the past 30 years, the number of people also living in coastal areas of high risk of rising sea levels has increased from 160 million to 260 million people. So more and more, we are seeing that people all over the world are being affected by climate change, and they are having to leave their hometowns. No one wants to leave their hometown just because they don't want to leave their families. They don't want to leave, what they have known that are not, they've been in this country for over 20 years and they haven't been able to visit Mexico or their home country in that long, and they haven't been able to see their parents for that long. So there's a huge misconception as to why people are coming here. It's not because they want to, it's because they have to. And what we're doing with the NEJC, we are building people power alongside our member organizations like Make the Road, Chispa, and our other members. We're hosting listening sessions to hear directly from people about what it is that they are facing. And one of the things that we are hearing, and this past session, we worked on the outdoor worker bill along with Senator Flores, who sponsored that bill. We wanted to protect people that work outdoors, and a lot of the immigrants that are coming here, they're working construction, they're working landscaping. So it is estimated that about 40% of the outdoor workers identify either as Black or Hispanic. And with the increase of heat exposure, and more cities around the country are facing more extreme heat, it is projected that these workers that work outdoors are going to lose $55 billion just in wages alone. And that alone affects a lot of people of color and primarily immigrants.
Absolutely. And I think that, or like lack of knowledge, right, about why people are immigrating. And it is for a reason. It's not, people don't just decide one morning they're going to uproot their lives, uproot their families, cross this make this incredibly difficult journey for nothing. And I think that's often lost in the conversation. And I want to go back to how that ties into, in general, the misdirection with Zach. But before I do, you spoke a lot about, the policy areas that you all are working on. And I wanted to bring Tony back in because at Make the Road, they have a huge membership of both immigrant members and members that have immigrant family members or a few generations in.
I love this question too. So I think that it's important. Organizations like mine, where I have the privilege to work, we exhaust every sort of avenue, right? And as an organizer, I came up organizing with labor groups and political campaigns. It's important to exhaust every avenue, right? So you organize, you canvass, you phone call, you text, everything, right? And I view lobbying as just another extension of organizing, right? And Senator Flores kind of mentioned a little bit about when you're bringing policy, it's important, right? If even if you don't think it's going to make it, right? Because the opposition is always doing that. And I think that it's important to note that a lot of the opposition, people who are in opposition to a lot of the policies that make the road supports, don't have all of those avenues, right? They have one avenue, and it's money, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately for us, I don't ever believe organized money will beat organized people, right? But now I think lobbying is another extension. So I think the strategy that I use is just exhaust every avenue and just be unapologetically grumpy about it, right? Like if you disagree with their policy, let them know, right? I think that too many people take organizations like mine for granted, right? There's many organizations like mine in the state, and they are, they will assume that they're just going to get the support regardless of what they do. Because so they cater to certain industries. So when I lobby, my strategy is to and Cinthia sees me when I do this. My strategy is to like go in thinking that my opposition was just there, and leave thinking my opposition is going to come back right after me, right? I will call folks out, my opposition out. I don't mind doing that, right? And I think it's important to call, right? We're an organization with a lot of resources, and it's clear, and I'm grateful to work in an organization where my executive team, where I align with them. And yeah, the best strategy is exhaust every single avenue and be clear, and do not waver in your disagreement. Hold them accountable. If they're refusing to meet with you, show up at their offices, which we're almost at that point with some folks. So, but that's the strategy. Show up because the opposition is showing up. And Cinthia and Senator Flores know exactly what the outdoor worker bill, the opposition showed up, right? And when I was moving a bill that was SB 92, which is the street vendor bill, the opposition showed up, right? Everybody, I had lobbyists tell me that they were going to say, and I quote, "I'm going to kill your bill," right? So they show up, they do that. And I tell them, I was like, imagine how great Nevada would be if your entity did not exist, right? So don't be grumpy about it. Be unapologetically grumpy about it. Move in the building that way as a lobbyist, and in organizing, move that way as well, right? So those are my 2 cents.
I love that. Be grumpy about it. And it pairs so beautifully with Senator Flores. Let's push pro-immigrant policies, because they are pushing anti-program immigrant policies every time, right? So yeah, I love that. I do want to go to one more question for Zach, and then if there's any questions from the audience, please share with us now, because I do want to have a chance to give everybody kind of some final thoughts before we wrap. But before we get to all that, Zach, feel free to tie this in with a question that I'm going to attempt to tie it in with a question that we had in the chat. But I wanted to ask in general how individuals and organizations can effectively push back against these false narratives and promote accurate info that are now having a positive view with their current president, and kind of seeing why those changes can't be put here and vice versa. So that was it.
Yeah, I'll try to.
Yeah.
No, you're fine. Yeah, it's all good. I get it. So I'm gonna say, I think really from our perspective at America's Voice, and really what we talk about is trying to meet people where they're at, but not leave them there. And so I think for many folks, especially those not close to the immigration issue, by not having to themselves immigrate or have a close family member that has done that, it can be a confusing morass, because there's lots of mis and disinformation out there. So they may not think what is actually true and how difficult it is. It's like we heard here tonight. And so I think there is a need to move folks for reform. And I think it's important to think about that our immigration system hasn't been updated in well over 30 years. Since Ronald Reagan was president, we haven't updated our immigration system. And our economy has changed. The United States has changed. We need a 21st century immigration policy to reflect the changing nature of immigration. And from that, I think we can, in this election year, start to think about what we talk about as kind of a both and policy. One, and that means that we need to think about a process of creating the pathways to legalization, to citizenship that don't already exist. As Senator Flores, we talked about, right, there is many folks that are like, oh, you have to get in line. Well, I've been looking around for a long time and I can't figure out where the line is. And I think there's many people that would like to be able to get into a line, but that one currently doesn't exist. And so we need to create those policies. And so I think it's helpful to think about the folks that want to talk a lot about border security or have concerns about increases, about chaos at the border. And I think it's a natural feel if you don't know what's going on to say, I don't want chaos. I want a safe and orderly process. But I think the way that we get to a secure, orderly process at the border is through by providing legal paths to entry into the country and providing legal paths to legalization and citizenship for our long settled undocumented neighbors. And that's why I think it's a both and conversation that we need to be having, that we can't just talk about security alone or some kind of punitive process that hasn't worked. And I think it's critical for us to think about, like, as we're bridging the divides, as we're thinking about pushing back on the disinformation, is to have that positive affirmative vision. To do a little bit of a hard pivot, I think, on some of this to your other question, is the disinformation that we are seeing, it doesn't have a border, that it flows from the United States and into other countries and back again. And I think for the example for the El Salvadorian president, right, he tonight is at CPAC, which is a conservative conference where Donald Trump is going to speak at, right? They're talking to one another using some of the same harmful narratives and the same anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant narratives, even though he's from El Salvador, right, coming to the United States to push that disinformation. And in some of the research that we found is that the idea that the border is open, which is not true, when people in regional countries that have had migration hear that disinformation, they're actually twice as more likely to immigrate to the United States, to try to make that harrowing journey north, because they have been told by bad actors, replicated by elected officials, that it's actually an easy process to come in. So now is the time to give up all your money to make a harrowing journey north. And so I think it's really important to think about, one, what is the positive version of that, but also understanding and calling out some of the disinformation, because that's fueling some of the challenges that we're facing. And so it's a bit of doing both of those things, which can be difficult, but it's going to be necessary, because in this election cycle, we're going to be faced with hundreds of millions of dollars in anti-immigrant messaging blasted over the airways. And folks in all across Nevada know that's coming. And every time every commercial gets turned on, right, there's going to be some kind of fear-mongering narrative about how we should blame our immigrant neighbors, both the ones that have been here and the ones that are new, for all of our problems. And I think we need to understand that that's a false narrative, and that there's a better positive solution we can address.
Absolutely. I feel like I could do a whole show, but I wouldn't, because it would just be me being mad the whole time about this whole open borders and about the whole narratives that, people, oh, sorry, got distracted, saw the baby. Yes, I digress. I won't even go there, because we are at time, and I do want to respect everybody that is joining us. It has been such a great conversation. There was so many more things I wish we had time to discuss, but before we wrap, I do want to go to final thoughts. I'm going to start with the senator, because he has the baby, and everybody should see him on camera.
Well, I want to introduce you all to baby Flores. And I just wanted to say thank you to you all. With every conversation, it just feels like we're having the same conversation over and over. And it's fair to feel that way. And it's important to acknowledge it too, because I don't want folks to feel like, I'm just listening to the same thing. Well, what's the point? One is we need to re-energize each other, refocus, kind of get everybody aligned again with kind of what the mission is. Second, I always use kind of like my son as my reminder that even though the conversations are still happening, and it's the same one that we feel like it's been ongoing for a long time, there's a lot of young humans that are standing right behind us, right? Who need to, who are kind of counting on us. And then the last thing is, when we talk about immigration, don't shy away from talking about ideas of like, look, we want to make sure that we're not allowing drugs to come in, and we want to make sure that we don't have folks who are doing XYZ that we don't want. You know, you can have that conversation and also have a humane conversation. You can have that conversation and also, drop some data on how that's a tiny percentage of any population, right? If we break it down of men or women or black, brown, Asian, whatever you want it, right? There's always going to be a percentage of humans that are doing things that they're not supposed to. Like I feel like we don't have to shy away from that, because when we do, sometimes right away we close the door on some of the folk that we're trying to reach who need to be educated. So you can meet people in a place of, sure, I agree with making sure this, but by the way, did you know that statistically that's a little bit off? Oh, by the way, did you realize? And it just allows you into the room, even if it's just for a little bit. And that's important, because I think it's easy for us to just pick a side and engage in the conversation in that way. But when we do that, we end up being in the same room with the same people constantly. And I think it's important that we take this narrative into other rooms. And I think that's, always my big ask. And I appreciate you all. Whatever I can help with, please reach out. Right now, I'm in the process of picking BDRs and getting legislation squared away. Please, I still have slots. If there's stuff you want me to work with you on, we got to win the election. That's important too. But this is the time that we're also working on the policy. So please, 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 if there's anything I can do to help you and carry a bill for you, reach out.
Thank you so much, Senator. I really appreciate that. I'll take it to Cinthia. Final thoughts.
Yeah, final thoughts, just to piggyback a little bit on what Senator Flores said. We find ourselves in different rooms and it's constantly the same people. We do need to start bringing in more of our community. And that is something that we are working at doing at the NEJC through our listening sessions. We are not going to stop just with the listening sessions. We plan on continuing to engage the participants in different ways. And I know that, Make the Road's doing a great job at bringing in community folks that normally wouldn't have a seat at the table. There are orgs out there working on that. And I just want to remind people again that when we think about immigration, a lot of us, we are immigrants. Let's not forget where our roots are. And let's be a little bit more passionate towards those that are immigrating right now, because at the end of the day, they're not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they don't have any other choice.
Absolutely. Thank you. I love that. Tony, go ahead.
I think, just my final thought would be, two final thoughts is, don't let some of these folks, some of these elected officials take your vote for granted or your organization's support for granted. Make them work for it, regardless of who it is. Let them know that you should be incorporated in the conversation when there's policy that's going to impact a community that you represent or that you advocate for. And then lastly, just thank you to you, Paula and Brian and the rest of your team and all the attendees for inviting me to be a part of panelists that are so amazing and folks that I look up to. And I know I just met you, Zachary, a bit ago, but I feel like I can look up to you as well. But yeah, I'm just so honored. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I saw big agreements from Baby Flores while you were speaking, so he agrees. Zach, please take us away.
Yeah, I love that point. I think I was a union organizer for a number of years myself, and we always had the chant, if you want our vote, come get our vote. And I think that is a really important thing. Just want to make sure we're uplifting from Tony as well. And I just want to thank everybody for being here and inviting me in to talk to you all this evening. I think two key things I think that are helpful to remind us moving forward is that we are the majority. There is a pro-immigrant majority in this country, and that has been solidly the case for many, many years. Despite hundreds of millions of dollars demonizing immigrants, the vast majority of this country is still pro-immigrant because we know that's who we are. That's what makes this country such an amazing place, is the immigrants generation after generation that have changed and developed and improved this country. And so I think it's good to remember that, right? That there might be a vocal minority, but we still are the majority in that piece. The last piece I'll leave on is I think it's important to remember going into the election cycle is that pro-immigrant policies are pro